Okay, then there was one point of Louis Althusser's which I didn't make yesterday because I thought the class had already become too long, and in my um, th- this thing to finish that, I overlooked one particular point. Uh, when I was talking to you, talking to you about the two theses of ideology that you find in uh, Louis Althusser. In the two theses, uh, I told you that the first thesis, he more or less agrees with Marx, with the idea that, with the notion that ideology masks reality and therefore facilitates the domination of one class by another. Okay, ideology. This is the what you find in the first thesis. The second thesis I told you is where he says that uh, the representation, I'm sorry, the um, ideology there is not spatial nor is it simply representational, but it is something physical and pertains to the body as much as it does to the mind. Now, here in this particular thesis, along with the interpellation, I hope you remember I talked to you about interpellation, which is some kind of, you know, socializing right from the childhood uh, to make people believe that this is the right thing and the others are wrong. And it doesn't work at the level of an individual, it will work at the level of entire populations. And he also says that these ideas people think are their own. They don't realize that they have been subtly introduced into their heads uh, right from the time of their birth. So ideology starts acting on the mind and body right from the time of the birth. Okay, that is what he called interpellation. And and in the ideological state apparatus, uh, he talks about this particular thing happening subtly through schools, through churches, through various other institutions where people gather together. But he said at one time the most dominant institution which was used to carry out this kind of an interpellation uh, and the use of the ideological state apparatus, which I told you is civil society and not the agencies of the state, not the institutions of the state. Uh, there he also goes on there when he talks about the two theses on ideology. In the second thesis, he also makes an argument that even if the revolution succeeds and somehow a classless society is created, it's still it still requires, one second, Maya, can you close the door please? It still requires uh, yeah, ideology for social cohesion. So that is the structural aspect. Okay, this is the structural aspect, which is both linguistic and societal. Okay, so this is what was a point that I didn't make yesterday. So it's not just if the revolution fails that ideology will continue to exist, but ideology will exist even if the revolution is successful, because uh, otherwise, without ideology, there'll be no social cohesion. And the language that people have got used to, the usage of the language, say if it is the communist revolution, the language of the revolution itself becomes an ideology as far as Marx is concerned, Althusser is concerned. And he will say that that language which talks about equality, everybody playing part in the productive process, distribution of social wealth equally, all that itself will become an ideology. So that is what holds people together structurally, and that is a linguistic structure. And the social structure is generated on the basis of this ideology, and the social structure continues to perpetuate this kind of ideological cohesion. So he says without ideology, uh, there cannot be social cohesion. The species being of man is not possible without the intervention of ideology. This was the point that I didn't make yesterday. If you have any problems with this, you can ask me now. I'll move on to other things. Now, have you understood this? Do you have a problem with this? I assume you don't. All right then. That's Louis Althusser done and dusted. Now let's get to your syllabus says libertarianism, but you can't understand libertarianism without understanding liberalism is the dominant form of thinking in the modern period, and liberalism is that which is associated with what I talked to you yesterday in the evening about the four freedoms: free thinking, freedom of speech, free will, and free market. These are also constitutive of individualism, which privileges the individual over society. prior to the modern period, it was society that was over the individual, and so you have Aristotle saying what is good for society is good for the individual. So the notion of good is here a common good or good of all. I want you to remember this. Okay, this is a very important point. But when we come to the modern period, let's use uh, the title of a book by Christopher Hill. It's a great book. Christopher Hill wrote a book called The World Turned Upside Down. Okay, that's what he wrote about when he talked, that's what he called his book, which talks about the modern period and all the things that happened in the modern period. So he says in the modern period, the world has been turned upside down, and therefore you have So this is what you have in the modern period. And so society is nothing but okay. I think that is self-explanatory. When Aristotle says man is a social animal, he's actually making a statement that the existence of man cannot be anything but social, which means that the existence of the human being cannot be an existence which is purely, what do we say? It cannot be something which is not social. It cannot be solitary. Okay, it is something that is necessarily social. And that is why the human species succeeds the way it does. Right? That is what Aristotle is trying to say. And therefore, for him, what is good for society is good for the individual. And this notion of good is that it is a common good. We look at the good of everyone as the good of one person because you are a part of society. So if it is good for society as a constitutive element of society, then it is good for you as well. That is what Aristotle says. Um, Now, if you look at the uh, idea, and I think Christopher Hill's book, you should read it. It also tells you all about the how the world was turned upside down. It goes right through the Industrial Revolution and all that, the Protestant ethic. So if you look at all those things, what you find in the modern period is that you privilege the individual over the collective. Okay, so what you are basically trying to say is what is good for the society need not be good for the individual. Okay, individuals will have to pursue their own good, and if you ask them How does society come into being? Then they'll say it is a group of individuals coming together to form a society, like you form an association, right? Uh, so that's how society is. It's an association formed by people who are willing to be a part of it. So the membership to this association called society is voluntary. If you don't want to be a part of the society, you needn't be a part of that society. It's that brazen. And so there is no such thing as collective good or social good. And these people, like John Locke, Adam Smith, were all staunch individualists. They claim that the idea of uh, a good of society can be pursued by each individual working for his own good. If every individual or each individual works for his or her own good, then it uh, basically means that people are pursuing their own, they are also pursuing the good of society, because if everybody in society is trying to pursue their good, then obviously it leads to the good of society. Which is a perverse way of looking at things. But somebody like John Locke is extremely shrewd, and he provides a justification for this. I'll do that when we go to the social contractualists, not now. He's very, very shrewd. Okay, so he points out how the pursuit of individual good can also lead to the good of all. Okay. Later on, that theory is debunked by Rousseau, but Locke is actually quite convincing when he makes this particular claim that the pursuit of individual good can lead to the good of all people in society. Uh, Now, this is broadly speaking the foundation of liberalism. What I have spoken about so far is not liberalism in its entirety. It is just the foundation of what constitutes liberalism. Okay, so now I have been talking to you about these freedoms. Let us try to understand how liberalism actually operates and why it is called liberalism. Let us also try to understand if liberalism is a unified, cohesive body of thinking, or is liberalism something else? That is the question that we need to answer. The first thing that you need to understand is that it is not an ideology. An ism need not be an ideology. An ism is usually considered to be uh, something which has a cohesive uh, and binding ideas which are commonly held by a number of people. So I have a problem when people talk about Hinduism, for example, because this cohesion that we are talking about, this particular thing about cohesive ideas, ideas that are consistent with each other, they are absent in Hinduism. First and foremost, Hinduism does not have monotheism. Not only that, even when it is believed to be not a religion, if you still look at this idea of what Hinduism is, can you say that these are the elements that are common to this particular thing called Hinduism? You can't identify any set of ideas which are cohesively built into Hinduism. You have so many different and often contradictory ideas that are present in what people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy called Hinduism. I think Ram Mohan Roy was the person who coined that uh, phrase, Hinduism. It's not an ism. Let me tell you why. First of all, there is no monotheism. There is pantheism and there is polytheism. Okay. And so that is an indication that people who pray to different gods see things differently. At one time, there was this huge divide between the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites. The Shaivites believed that Shiva was the main deity. The Vaishnavites believed that Vishnu was the main deity. So there you have already two groups contradicting each other. Okay, and then if you look at our understanding of the caste system has been so colored by the Ambedkarite system, which is actually, and I'm putting myself out for my neck to be chopped by saying this in a class that is being recorded and will be put on YouTube. It's been so colored by Ambedkarite thinking that we tend to think that there is a conspiracy of sorts where the upper castes, especially the Brahmins, somehow stood together and repressed the lower castes. Now, nothing can be farther from the truth. The repression of the lower caste is not a concerted action. The repression came from the fact that people believed in a certain kind of cosmology based first in Varna system, which later on got converted to a Jati system. And the Brahmins themselves are not a united lot. The Brahmins are not, oh, you're a Brahmin, I'm a Brahmin, let's go oppress somebody who is not a Brahmin. They are not a united lot at all. Okay? You will see that there are so many different kinds of Brahmins. Each sect of the Brahmins, so Brahmin itself is sectarian. It is very, very sectarian. And each sect of the Brahmins has its own rituals, has its own way of looking at the world, which does not agree with another set. For example, let me tell you what happened in my own life. When I was getting married, my parents told my wife's parents that you people put muhurtam, that will be, or a muhurat, and we'll go by that. So that particular muhurat was put up by the priest that my wife's family in Calcutta believed in. And when that muhurat was showed to some priest here to perform the wedding, those who belong to the Madhva Brahmin sect said that they will not perform this wedding on that muhurat. The objections were several, but the important objection was that this was on the 12th day of the fortnight. And on the 11th day, the Madhvas fast. And after fasting, uh, they don't, the very next day, they don't perform any rituals. So they had to go look for another sect. And one of my closest friends, a fellow who I still see as a brother, though we have politically grown miles and miles apart, uh, he got married a few months before I did. And so I inherited everybody from the Purohit to the caterer to the Nadaswaram players, everybody. Lock, stock, and barrel. So my wedding was performed by a Smarta Purohit because they don't have objections that the Madhvas have. So you see, Brahmins are not alike, and Brahmins often fight. And I give you, even in the Vaishnavites itself, by the way, both Smartas and Madhvas are Vaishnavites. Even in the Vaishnavites itself, there have been fights including how you put this namam. Some people put a U namam, some people put a Y-shaped namam. So I keep telling people this particular incident. I don't know if I told you this. There was a case of an elephant um, in a particular temple, in a Vaishnavite temple in Tamil Nadu. I forget which temple this is. And so there were two sects within the Vaishnavites. And those sects, by the way, the sects that you find in Tamil Nadu, you won't find anywhere else. Okay. So they had a fight about what kind of namam to put on the forehead of the elephant, the temple elephant. One said that you had to put uh, U namam, and the other said you had to put a Y namam. Okay, so they fought over that. Finally, they went to court. The courts didn't know what to do. They kept kicking it to various different levels. It went to the House of Lords, which is a highest court of appeal. And when that also didn't work out, then it went to the Star Chamber, which is a special, which is the equivalent of a special bench of the Supreme Court as we have it today. And there they said 6 months put U, 6 months put Y, because they didn't know the tenets of what is what. Right. So this is I mentioned this before. This is what happens with Hinduism. Though in a synecdoche, the opposite of this also can happen, which is you confuse. Oh, sorry. This should go reverse, where the part is confused for a whole. Okay. This is also a synecdoche where the whole is confused for a part. But in the case of Hinduism, it's not a whole confused for a part. I'm sorry about that. I think I should remove this. That is a synecdoche. The reason why I have dealt with this in such length is because at one level, liberalism also comes pretty close to being a synecdoche. It also comes pretty close, very close to being a synecdoche because there's no one form of liberalism. What we have as Thomas Hobbes So you see, there are so many forms. Thomas Hobbes is an individual. If you read Macpherson, Macpherson claims that Hobbes is not just an individualist, he's a possessive individualist. Okay, now John Locke is a classical liberal. He's also an individualist. And what binds these two together, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, what binds these two together is the fact that both believed in the existence of natural rights. Now, then you have a skeptic liberal, David Hume, who questioned the idea of natural rights. He said, who says there are these natural rights? Who has given natural rights to human beings? Right? So that is the question he asks. And he says anything that is based in the concept of natural rights is not something that is sustainable as a philosophical or a social idea, because there's no way you can establish that these are natural rights and that they have been given to you. So in answer to that, you have the birth of utilitarianism, and you have Jeremy Bentham and James Mill, who substitute the idea of natural rights with that of the pursuit of pleasure. And Jon Stewart Mill, who started off as a utilitarian because he was homeschooled, and his father, James Mill, educated him. And so the influences of his father on him originally were obvious to see. But when Jon Stewart Mill grew up and started looking at the society around him, started seeing movements like the Chartist movement, which is demanding rights, and when he came under the influence of Harriet Taylor, then he talked about the equality of the sexes, which nobody did, not the men, certainly. Probably he's the first man who talked about the equality of the sexes. And he talked about enfranchisement of women and all men. He talked about that. And he's almost socialist when you start looking at his ideas, where he says those who have inherited property should not get an unnecessary advantage in society. He said that these people should begin exactly how the people who don't have property begin. So his first idea was confiscation of estates. Confiscation of estates by the government. That was his idea originally. Then he said, okay, if that is not possible, then you have to have taxation, and you have to have an inheritance tax. So that's almost socialist. If I put it as socialist liberal, and like I said, since I'm putting it on YouTube, I don't want people to misunderstand and think that I'm teaching all kinds of rubbish. Um, but he came close to being a socialist. Okay. And he gave support to the working class movement for their enfranchisement. He said that will lead to the tyranny of the majority. But he said, doesn't matter, even if it leads to the tyranny of the majority, it is still moral. So he's one of the first Anglophone philosophers to talk about morality. He says it is a moral thing to do, morally correct thing to do, to enfranchise the disenfranchised. Doesn't matter if they don't have money. Okay, so when we talk about moral, we talk about Rawls, and then we draw the connection straight to Kant, and from Kant we go to Rousseau, but somehow we bypass Jon Stewart Mill, who I assume would have played an important role in John Rawls constructing his theory of justice, which is a completely moral work, a work based in morality. Yes, sir.
Sir, why do scholars consider J.S. Mill as a prophet of empty liberty? What is meant by empty liberty?
Empty liberty.
Yes,
Is
sir.
that no? Which scholar called him that? Hmm? Which scholar called him that?
He has that sobriquet, prophet of empty liberty.
No, 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 no. That is, there are so many people who write, and yeah, I've heard that. I know why they call him that. They call him the prophet of empty liberty because this is something that came from the Marxist side. Okay? Because of the fact that he talked about liberty, and the Marxists have always believed that liberty is a meaningless concept without equality. Okay? Without equality, it is a meaningless concept. What will people do with a liberty when there is no equality, when they are not treated as equals? That's why the Marxists used to call him that at one time. That is because they didn't read him properly. They didn't read him properly. If you read his essay on liberty, you will find out that Mill is a deeply moral man. Okay. And the other reason why he's called whatever you called him is because of the fact that he says the enfranchisement of the workers leads to the tyranny of the majority. Sorry, because Mill recognized that there is a possibility of a tyranny of the majority because there are more number of workers than there are more number of property owners. There are more numbers of the poor, and therefore uh, they could if they are given the right to vote, it can lead to tyranny of this majority, which he believes leads to the denudation of culture or high culture, as it was called, which is, music. High culture is fine arts, music, which is the pursuit of the rich, right? So he was seen as somebody who was, because of the use of that phrase, tyranny of the majority, he was considered to be someone who really didn't care much about the workers. And to complicate matters, the system of voting that was suggested by Mill also, on the face of it, seems anti worker. Okay, on the face of it. Why? Because he said, not one man, one vote. Okay, first he talked about preferential vote system. Then he talked about one man having not just one vote, but several votes. Votes meaning that if you were living in London, but you had a tract of agricultural land in Yorkshire, or if you had a piece of property in Leicestershire. So if you have these kind of things, then wherever you have something, you have to be given a right to vote there. So on the one hand, he was talking about how people should all have that equality of beginning, which you will understand when I talk about Locke. So on the one hand, he was saying that. And on the other hand, he was saying that in order to protect your own different properties, you should be given multiple votes. So that didn't sit well with a lot of people because they saw a contradiction in him. And therefore, Mill is a very misunderstood philosopher. By telling you that, I'm not saying I understood him very well. Okay? All I'm trying to tell you is that there are these contradictory tendencies in Mill. Sometimes he seems like he's so moral that he's almost socialist. He even drew some praise from Marx because they were contemporaries. He even drew some praise from Marx. But he also drew a lot of criticism from the socialists because they say he was a halfway person. He said this also, he said that also. So I will answer that question properly when we do Jon Stewart Mill. I'll give you a definitive answer why he is not a prophet of empty liberty. I'm not going to
Yes,
do
sir.
that now because
Okay, sir.
we don't need to do it here. Okay. We have to
Yes,
study Jon Stewart Mill in the first semester, in this semester. When I teach Mill, that is when I'll give you a definitive answer. Okay, because
Okay.
otherwise now I'll have to dig deep into his philosophy, which will take us away from what I'm trying to do, which is establish that liberalism is not really something which is the only underlying thing, that are two underlying things that are binding on in all these different forms of liberalism, seem to be individualism and individual property, and the idea of laissez-faire, and the state being a minimal state, government being a minimal government, and maximizing of freedoms of the individual. Those seem to be the binding aspects. Those seem to be the binding aspects of liberalism. So when we do roles, I'll also tell you very briefly, because again, we have to do roles in the end of the second semester. When I'm doing Rawlsian liberalism, I'll tell you about Michael Sandel. Okay, Michael Sandel says he's a great admirer of Rawls. I doubt if he is. Um, Michael Sandel's criticism of Rawls is that Rawls stopped halfway. He said by bringing justice into the parlance of liberalism, but not extending it to the idea of community. So the critique of Rawls by Michael Sandel is actually called the communitarian critique. So he says Rawls stopped halfway, didn't finish the project that he could have. Okay. Now, is that a valid criticism? Because from this St. Andrews University, where you don't have a political science department, but you have a political philosophy department, you have one particular professor. He's also in his own right a thinker. Professor Timothy O'Hagan uh, is obviously Irish when you find a name like O'Hagan. Timothy O'Hagan is a staunch Rawlsian, and he calls Michael Sandel a dwarf, DWARF, dwarf riding on the shoulders of a giant for his own publicity. Riding on the shoulders of a giant, if a dwarf sits on the shoulders of a giant, then he'll be above the giant. So Timothy O'Hagan is so contemptuous of Michael Sandel. So there are all these criticisms. sobriquets, as you're calling them. I don't know if they qualify to be called sobriquet. A sobriquet usually is not a derogatory thing. Okay, a sobriquet uh, is usually a compliment. It's a compliment. So there was this American friend of mine, and I don't know if you people ever saw that social networking site called Orkut. Did anyone see it? ORKUT. It was before Facebook hit the thing. It was by Google, and this man created my Orkut social profile, and his name is John Andrews, an amazing gentleman, and he put my name as Satish P. Floyd. Okay, so everybody was, who is Satish P. Floyd? Then he put my photograph, and then everybody under, Satish. Why? Because of my obsession with all things Pink Floyd. Okay, and he also wrote there that Satish knows so much about music that it is scary. Now, those are sobriquets. Those are things which are not derogatory. They are, in a way, they are complimentary, in a way. There's another friend of mine who used to call me, he's also an American, and he played drums with us. And he's an amazing drummer, most amazing drummer. And this chap used to call me, he used to say Satish R. Waters, because in Pink Floyd, I considered Roger Waters to be the mastermind. And he used to say Satish can't speak about music for 2 minutes without somehow bringing in Roger Waters. So he used to call me, hello, Mr. Satish R. Waters. And one day when we played a concert, and I introduced everybody in the band, and he then took the mic and said, he didn't introduce himself. His name is Satish R. Waters. That is a sobriquet. It's not, but to call him an empty prophet is an insult. And I don't think he deserves it. It's not a sobriquet. Okay, so let me make a confession. So before I make that confession, I'd like to switch off the recording because I don't want the whole world to know this. Before I switch off, we'll meet tomorrow. I'll start off with just tie up some loose ends about liberalism. Like I said, I don't want to go into too much detail. And we'll go into libertarianism, which itself is not something that will consume too much time. There isn't much to libertarianism. So we'll do that tomorrow. Okay.